Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on Victoria's emission reduction targets. Can we achieve a 1.5 degree trajectory? My name is Rebecca Burden, and I'm the Managing Director of the Energy Transition Hub. I'd like to commence this morning by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands, the various lands from which we're joining this webinar, and paying my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and in particular the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations who are the traditional elders of the lands on which I meet, from which I join this meeting. The seminar this morning is being hosted by the Climate and Energy College and the Energy Transition Hub. I should mention that it's being recorded and it will be available on both of the websites for the Climate and Energy College and the Energy Transition Hub after the event is finished. We would love you to ask questions, and we invite you to do that throughout the course of the presentation by clicking on the chat function and typing your questions in there. We'd encourage you to make those questions available to everyone. It's always interesting to see what is coming up and stimulates discussion amongst the participants, as well as just to rather than just making them available to the panelists. Could we also ask you to click the raise hand button so that we can easily identify you when we come to questions at the end of the seminar presentations. I'll now introduce the speakers who we have presenting this morning. We have the Honourable Lily D'Ambrosio, the Victorian Minister for Energy, Environment and Climate Change, and also the Victorian Minister for Solar Homes and the State Member for Mill Park. She's been clearly a driving force behind the Climate Change Act in Victoria and is joining us with a recorded statement this morning. We also have Lee Eubank, who's the Act on Climate Coordinator at Friends of the Earth Melbourne, and who was who commissioned the work that is being discussed here today. We also have doing the main presentation, the two researchers who led this work, Dylan McConnell, who's an energy analyst at the Climate and Energy College and the Energy Transition Hub, and who brings a detailed understanding of the cost structure of energy technologies in the electricity market, and Rachelle Meyer, who researches climate change adaptation and mitigation in the land sector at the University of Melbourne. For her PhD thesis, which she undertook at the Climate and Energy College, Rachelle used a whole farm system modelling approach to quantify the agro-ecosystem benefits and mitigation implications of soil carbon in Victorian grazing systems. So we'll move now to the Minister's statement. Thanks, Tash.
I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are all on. And I want to pay my respects to all elders, past, present and emerging, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of other communities who may be listening today. Thanks to all of you for connecting through this virtual platform. The first half of 2020 has certainly presented us with many challenges, from this past summer's devastating fires to the coronavirus emergency we're currently facing. I want to speak with you this morning about some of the work the Victorian Government is doing to reduce our emissions and continue to drive investment in renewable energy. Climate change is a major concern for the community, both locally and across the globe. As one of the world's largest grassroots environmental networks, Friends of the Earth has been working hard campaigning on these urgent issues. We know the Victorian community is looking for strong and effective action. The Victorian Government is getting on with it, with legislation, strong policy and committing real investment in turning climate change around. Through our world-leading Climate Change Act, we have committed to net zero emissions in Victoria by 2050. We're on track to reach our 2020 emissions reduction target of 15 to 20%. We know there's great opportunity in tackling climate change, with renewable energy driving investment in regional communities, lowering power bills for Victorians and the opportunity to leave a cleaner, healthier environment for the next generations. In the past few months, the Victorian Government has taken a number of important steps to help ensure that Victoria has the transmission infrastructure it needs to continue to drive investment in renewable energy. As many of you would be aware, Victoria recently passed the National Electricity Victoria Amendment Bill of 2020, which will cut red tape and empower the government to take urgent action and make timely decisions that are in the state's best interests. As a first step, We've asked AEMO to run a tender for a System Integrity Protection Scheme, SIPS, which would expand the capacity of the Victorian New South Wales interconnector. This would allow us to send more power between our two states and provide a much needed boost to reliability. On the infrastructure front, we are supporting the construction of new transmission lines in both the north and west of the state to unlock the enormous solar and wind resources that exist in those regions. This includes the Western Victorian Transmission Network project, which will open up wind resources, and the construction of VNI West, a new interconnector between Victoria and New South Wales. We'll continue to work proactively to identify transmission needs and work collaboratively with all levels of government to bring forward investment quickly and efficiently. We are also taking action to ensure that Victoria can benefit from the next wave of renewable energy innovation. For example, Victoria is taking proactive steps to make sure we can capture the enormous potential of green hydrogen. We've established the Victorian Hydrogen Investment Program, through which we will develop a green hydrogen industry development plan. This will seek to identify specific opportunities for our state in this exciting area. We have also supported work through the Australian Hydrogen Centre. This is undertaking groundbreaking studies that will look at the capacity to inject hydrogen into Victoria's gas network, looking at opportunities in both a specific regional town and the capacity to inject hydrogen across the state. Finally, we're ensuring that Victorian communities continue to benefit from the transition to renewable energy. Just last week, I announced a new $1 million round of funding for community energy projects through the New Energy Jobs Fund. We've also announced our $10.3 million solar on public buildings program that will help drive down power costs, create jobs and cut emissions while delivering local benefits to the many volunteer committees of managements across the state. We know Victorians want strong and lasting action on climate change, and we work best when we work together. I would like to thank the Friends of the Earth and the University of Melbourne for your hard work on emissions reduction and job creation. By working together, we can meet the challenges and capture the opportunities which protect our environment and our future. I hope you are all staying safe at home, and I want to thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. Good luck.
Thank you, and we're really delighted the Minister took the time to record that message. We'll move now to Lee Eubank, the Act on Climate Coordinator at Friends of the Earth.
Good day, everyone. Lee Eubank here, and I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also note that sovereignty was never ceded over this land. So yeah, it's a really exciting day today for everyone to get a preview of this University of Melbourne modelling on emissions reduction options and some of the benefits that come with that. And just a little bit of background on me and Friends of the Earth. So Friends of the Earth has been campaigning for environmental justice in Victoria for over 45 years now. And it all started with a campaign to prevent a nuclear power plant from being built on French Island. And in all of the 8 years that I've worked at Friends of the Earth, you know, working side by side with community is right at the heart of what we do. So when it comes to climate change, we do have a problem. At the national level, since the election of the federal coalition, we have seen policy failure on climate. As a result, we've seen emissions increasing year on year since the removal of the carbon pricing scheme, and we're not on track to meet our commitment to the international Paris Agreement. And it's only in the last few months that we've seen a plateauing of our emissions. So there is this ongoing policy failure at the national level, and that's why we really do need to see states and territories do a heavy lift and drive progress. In Victoria, we do have a different story to tell, which is amazing. So Victoria's emissions are falling. As the Minister noted, we are on track to see an emissions reduction of 20% below 2005 levels by the end of this year. And that raises the question, why is there so much success happening at the state level? So over the last decade, we have seen several very successful grassroots campaigns. So firstly, there was the campaign to prevent fracking, a risky fossil fuel extraction process that does release greenhouse gas emissions through fugitive emissions, and also when we're burning that fossil fuel. So we saw over 73 communities band together and declare themselves coal and gas field free. And as a result of that overwhelming community sentiment, we saw all parties in the Victorian Parliament unite to legislate the country's first ever ban on fracking. On the flip side of the coin, we saw another community effort connecting communities from Portland, where there are wind workers, to communities in Hepburn, where there's a community-owned wind farm, and up to Yakandanda, calling for the state government to match their ambition on renewables. So we saw in 2017, the Andrews government legislate a Victorian renewable energy target, and that has done a very heavy lift when it comes to cutting emissions in the state. It will create thousands of jobs, and it represents an investment in the Victorian economy of $12 billion. So it really does start to substantiate the argument that we've been making all along, that climate action, it delivers jobs and it delivers good economic outcomes for Victoria. And thirdly, we also saw a movement-wide campaign, groups such as Friends of the Earth, Environment Victoria, and others calling for Hazelwood to be replaced with renewable energy. And we did see that close a few years ago, and only weeks ago we finally saw this symbolic removal of the towers down in Morwell. So what we're kind of looking at Friends of the Earth and across the movement is, how do we build on this momentum? And on November 1, 2017, we had a celebration on the steps of Parliament to celebrate the commencement of the Victorian Climate Change Act. So, why were we celebrating? For three reasons. It requires the government to set interim emissions reduction targets every 5 years out to 2050. And the first of those is required to be set within 10 sitting days of March 31 this year. So the government does have out until August 6 to announce the interim emissions targets. The government's also required to prepare a climate change strategy by October 31, and required to undertake a sector pledge process where ministers are required to identify the greenhouse gas reductions that are within their portfolio, such as transport, agriculture, land use, so on and so forth. And over the last 18 months, we have seen a very, very worthy community effort. We've seen this incredible campaign emerge around the need for science-based targets. So the litmus test for the government when it comes to the emissions reduction targets, the sector pledges and the climate strategy is whether it does help us keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. So, we really do need to see the government, getting onto that emissions reduction trajectory as quickly as possible. And, communities have been holding actions such as these human sign events to really demonstrate the community power behind this push, and in their own communities. So Friends of the Earth, we were very lucky to have some resourcing to commission modelling from the college, and there is a knowledge gap that we really wanted to fill. So we wanted to understand what are the key opportunities for cutting emissions beyond the energy sector. That's very well known, but we need to start getting a grip on what are the key things that we can do in agriculture, in transport, land use, and industry to really rein in emissions. And given the experience that we've had with the Victorian renewable energy target, we wanted to understand what are the types of jobs and economic benefits that would come with those options. We do know that the COMBE report identified emissions cuts of 43% by 2025 and 67% by 2030 in order to get onto a 1.5 degree trajectory. But in reality, we need to see a heavier lift up front, probably in the order of at least 75% by 2030. And that would give us a longer tail to deal with sectors that are more difficult to decarbonise. And, it was kind of our intent that with the research that the Climate College would be doing, it would help the government make informed decisions about the interim emissions targets, the forthcoming climate strategy, and importantly, it would provide, an evidence base for ministers who are probably a little bit newer to the climate change policy space. And finally, it will help the government meet its commitment to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. So, yeah, I'm really pleased that we have Dylan McConnell and the University of Melbourne to preview some of their research today. And I really think it's going to kick off a good debate in the state and yeah, lead to better policy outcomes. So thank you.
Great, thanks for that, Lee. I've just shared my screen. Can everyone see that okay? Yes.
No, we can't, Dylan.
Cool. Oops. How about now?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, great. Thanks, Lee. Yeah, well, I think you've actually covered off on a bit of the stuff I wanted to just cover at the start, so I can probably skate over that relatively quickly. Yeah, so just in terms of what we're going to cover off today, the sort of introduction and context, I'll cover that off a bit, sort of a bit quicker now. Some stuff on the electricity sector that rolls in the transport sector and the industrial sector work, and then I'll pass over to our colleague, Dr. Rachelle Meyer, who will be talking about the land use sector and agricultural emissions. And then there'll be some sort of summary and concluding remarks and some time for Q&A. Yeah, so just as Lee mentioned, there's a statewide target of net greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. I saw a question in the chat bar about what state emissions actually means. So that's generally, well, in the case of Victoria, it basically means territorial emissions, any emissions that are emitted in the state of Victoria. It doesn't take into account things like embedded emissions that are exported from, sending things overseas or importing things, etc. It's just the actual emissions that are generated in the state of Victoria. So yes, there was an independent report to advise the Victorian Government on how they should achieve their net zero emissions target by 2050. And actually colleagues at the Climate and Energy College, specifically Malta Meinshausen, Anita Talberg and Jan, and I think maybe even Zebedee, who is here today, contributed to this. And that included, what a Victorian budget for, a climate budget for Victoria would look like, and that included one for sort of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now that report was delivered actually just on a year ago and recommended interim targets and sort of indicative trajectories for Victoria. The report also did highlight some potential opportunities to reduce emissions across the Victorian economy, but this work that we've sort of been looking at sort of looks to extend that. We'll touch on that a bit in a minute. So just quickly, that's what's in the report, the COMBE report, on terms of what sort of our straight line budgets might look like for the two different trajectories, 2 degree and a 1.5 degree. And yeah, as Lee said, it's 43% by 2025 and 67% by 2030 to be consistent with 1.5. It's worth pointing out something else that Lee mentioned. So this is the budget's, I guess, portrayed in a different way, the total aggregate budget, not a time series of budget. So the greens are 2 degree budget, the blues are a 1.5 degree budget. And I think the interesting thing here is, I guess, what the remaining budget post 2030, depending on what the 2030 target is. So, if we had a target of only, say, 55% by 2030, we've basically exhausted our entire carbon budget by then. And as Lee, I think, might have mentioned, the 75% target, which is right at the far end, still gives us a little bit of a budget to work with beyond 2030. Or put another way, this is also from the report, if we go to 45% by 2030, then literally our emissions would have to drop to zero, in 2030 from then onwards, to stay within that 1.5 degree budget. But if we go steeper, then we've got sort of more time, and we'll have a more gradual sort of trajectory compared to that sort of rapid drop off. Yes. For context, this is what Victoria's emissions look like, the sort of territorial emissions we talked about before, and perhaps unsurprisingly, they're pretty much historically dominated by electricity generation, and I guess there's a fair bit of coming from the transport sector, which I'll talk a bit more about later on. But this is essentially what we're looking at. There's a bit more of you're welcome to have a look at all this stuff is, publicly available, and you can go to the department website and download, and you can download all the data and look at this as much as you like. But basically the big parts are energy, so directed combustion and transport and electricity generation sort of make up in the vicinity of 80% of the emissions reductions. So the motivations for this work, as Lee sort of alluded to, were around looking at the abatement options to meet the 1.5 degree budget, because that was outside the scope of the COMBE analysis, and this work aims to analyse those opportunities and the benefits and the potential for Victoria, and specifically looking at transport, industrial emissions, land use, and electricity. Anyway, I'll get onto that when I start talking a bit more about electricity. Before I get started, I just wanted to provide a bit of an update, because not because of anyone's fault in particular, but generally speaking, the department's numbers are quite a lot out of date. This is just there's an estimate based on a few different sources, but electricity sector emissions estimates are pretty much real time and quite up to date. And based on what we've seen so far, emissions reductions are actually, I think, potentially running ahead of where the Minister and Lee actually said. I think it's quite likely that by the end of this financial year, they might even be above 20%. We might have already sort of made that 20% reduction on 2005 levels for this financial year. We've still got a bit of time to go on to find that out, but we're sort of sorry, that's the 2020 financial year. But it's sort of looking like we're actually going to what's that phrase? Meet and beat our targets in Victoria, unlike at the federal level. Now, I think it's probably worth pointing out that a lot of that has occurred in the electricity sector, and has been as a consequence of things like the BREP, but also the closure of Hazelwood. And we've actually seen some pretty dramatic falls in emissions. Again, these are numbers from AEMO, sort of updated to last financial year, and it's really quite impressive to see where we've already come in Victoria. And it's sort of we're looking at wind and solar generation increasing sort of by 7% in the last 4 years, and couple of days ago, the minister actually said, I think in the news, that we're on track to reach 25% renewable energy by the end of this year. That caught me a little bit by surprise, because I wasn't sure we were actually going to hit that. But as it turns out, it looks like we're about 24.7% renewable energy in Victoria. I just checked this the other day off Open. So yeah, by the end of this calendar year, sorry, that's 24.7% for the calendar year. By the end of this calendar year, we could well be at 25% renewable energy in Victoria. One thing that I wanted to just, I guess, stress or highlight about the significance of these numbers comes down to the wording, or some of the key points in the Paris Agreement, and that is around it reflecting highest possible ambition. Any sort of, I know Victoria's technically not signatory to the Paris Agreement, being a subnational state, but in terms of when we're thinking about what actually is a reasonable target and what is highest possible ambition, the fact that we have achieved a fairly substantial reduction in the last sort of decade, going, if we have achieved 20% by 2020, then it's sort of, there's good grounds for having a fairly ambitious target by 2025 to be consistent with the actual Paris Agreement text. Anyway, I'll just quickly go on to what I've been doing. Sort of unsurprisingly, I've been focusing on the electricity sector modelling, and yeah, Rachelle has been doing land use stuff. We had some other researchers looking at industrial electric emissions and transport emissions. But sort of underpinning a lot of this is electricity sector modelling, as is probably not a surprise to anyone in this audience. The electricity sector is critical to decarbonising the sector and facilitating and enabling deep decarbonisation in other parts of the economy. Now, what we've looked at here is, what we've used, I should say, is something called OpenSem. If you're not familiar with it, it's an open source capacity expansion model. It's basically an open source version of a model that the Australian Energy Market Operator uses in their development of the integrated system plan. I should say that the development of that model was actually supported by the Victorian Government and ARENA and a few other state governments. But it is all publicly available, and you can download and play around with it if you want to get your hands dirty in some Python code. And the basic idea of that is, it's to work out, how to keep the lights on at the lowest cost, and with other constraints. For example, in this case, things like renewable energy targets or emissions reduction targets. And this sort of works out what the least cost development pathway might be with those assumptions, and including things like renewable energy rollout plus transmission plus storage plus all of the above. So we used a variety of important assumptions, which I'll discuss a bit more in that. So firstly, some of the sort of policy inputs. So first of all, there was a VRET 2.0 scenario where we just looked at the legislated 40%. So we've had so the current VRET is 25% by 2020, which it looks like we're on track to meet. The sort of phase 2 of the legislated VRET target is 40% by 2025. So that was one particular scenario we looked at. The VRET phase 3, which is 50% renewable energy by 2030. Now that's sort of what the government has announced or committed to, but it's worth pointing out, and this sort of fell out of the modelling, that we're almost at 50% renewable energy in Victoria by 2025 under business as usual. Not quite, just under. So we sort of also looked at an accelerated VRET version where that 50% renewable energy target is actually achieved by 2025. And yeah, I should stress that's not government policy, but it's or any commitments, but that's where one of the scenarios we looked at. And the other one that we looked at, which is sort of receiving a lot of attention and interest at the moment, is the so-called Star of the South project down offshore in in Gippsland. This is actually now included as a technology, and there's data and traces and all the rest available from AEMO. So we can actually start modelling the impact of this on the power system. So that was another sort of exogenous input that was put into the modelling to have a look at how that will affect emissions. What was I going to say? Yes, as I sort of, I guess I mentioned, electrification is critical, and the sort of transport sector and industrial sector sort of modelling has fed into this electricity sector stuff. I'm not going to talk a great deal about what that has involved, but that generally relatively high level assumptions, or using existing analysis or modelling or modifying existing analysis and modifying for the Victorian context. In particular, looking at electric vehicle uptakes from the ISP in their sort of in their various scenarios. They have different uptakes, but they have a variety of modelling and consultant reports on looking at different electric vehicle uptakes and energy demands and tracing charging profiles and all those sort of things. So we've used basically the data that's used in the integrated system plan for that. That's just a diagram from one of the consultant reports that shows what the expected uptake is. Now, it should, even though it sort of doesn't look like a lot by sort of 2030-ish. I mean, it's at the sort of the middle third of the chart. It's worth pointing out that this is sales, not absolute numbers. So we're talking about several million, multiples of millions sales by 2030. So the aggregate number of vehicles actually in the different states and the different parts of the NEM are actually much higher than that. And I can't remember off the top of my head, but the terawatt hour figure for Victoria is in, it's in the several terawatt hour of additional demand, depending on the scenario. We also have some other, that obviously puts, I guess, demand into the electricity system, which goes back into that capacity expansion model, but it also reduces emissions through reducing direct emissions from combustion and I guess mode shifting to public transport. We had a few, I guess, high level assumptions around, basically from the huge report on the Melbourne Metro project. There's quite a lot of detail there on energy consumption and emissions reduction savings as well. The other thing that was, was looked at, it was basically looking at the electrification of low-grade heat. So essentially switching from gas to Victoria. Again, this results in more electricity demand, but less emissions, direct combustion emissions. Now, we only looked at a very, I think, quite conservative amount of conversion, and that's something we're sort of looking to explore and perhaps expand. And also, we also only looked at sort of very low-grade heat options because there's also options with high-grade heat and advanced manufacturing techniques that might be worth exploring a bit more for the sort of final analysis. So in terms of the sort of preliminary results, these are what we're sort of seeing just from the greenhouse gas perspective, just the millions of tonnes per annum reductions. So these are the sort of, so to put them in context, I probably should have put the current number there. So the current number for Victoria is about 110 million tonnes per year. So these different scenarios, all add or subtract from that reduction. So from that emissions sort of baseline and towards that 43% or 70% reduction by 2030 that we're sort of hoping to aim for. Now, I specifically haven't mentioned assumptions around coal closures. I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer section if there's time. There were actually no assumptions around coal closures, but yeah, I can talk a bit more about that in question and answers because I'm a bit cognizant of the time, and I want to pass over to my colleague Rachelle to talk a little bit about the land use sector. So hold on, I'll just do that now. There we go.
Thanks, Dylan.
Should be able to share screen now. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Right here. Okay, so hopefully everyone can hear me all right. Thanks for that, Dylan. I'm going to be covering the agriculture and land use sector emissions. This is going to focus primarily on giving a historic context to the scenarios that I've developed. And of course, the assumptions of the scenarios and how the results of those assumptions. So to start out, this is from the 2019 Victoria emissions report. It's the agriculture emissions broken down into the different sources of emissions. You can see that it doesn't vary a whole lot over this time period. And a couple things that I wanted to point out here is that enteric fermentation is the methane emission from the production of ruminant livestock, and also agricultural soils are technically challenging to mitigate. Now, there are options available that can reduce these emissions, and in some contexts, the reductions can actually be quite large, but the majority of these enteric methane emissions are in extensive systems, which is very hard to implement changes that have large impacts. So those two major emissions that really contribute the most to agricultural emissions are quite hard to mitigate substantially. I also wanted to point out a couple of things. Specifically, the 2005 emission is one of the highest reported during this period of 16.3 megatons, and 2016 was the lowest at 13.8 megatons. The projection from the 2018 report for 2020 is 15.3 megatons, which is just 0.4 increase from the 2017 emissions shown here. So not a whole lot of change in the recent years that aren't shown in this graph. So the land sector shows a lot more variation in the emissions over this time period. The main emission is from forests being converted to other land use, and the main sink is land being converted to forest. So again, when you look at the emissions and the sinks, many of these years are actually net sinks. 2005 was a sink of 5.3 megatons. The largest sink was in 2016, and that was 12 megatons. And the 2020 projection, and this is a big takeaway from this, is that blue, the light blue kind of teal bar there actually is declining. The plantations that created that sink are maturing, and that sink is just not going to be as strong going forward. So the sink is declining, and the projection for the total emissions and sink, the net for 2020, is expected to be 7.3 megatons. So that provides some sort of historic context for Victoria's emissions in these sectors, and is also heavily used in the development of the scenarios that I'll be discussing. So I took I decided to group the agriculture and land use emissions together. This has been done previously. There are a lot of good reasons to do this. The main one I would say is the lifespan of the emissions from agriculture, particularly methane, has a very short lifespan. It's a strong greenhouse gas, but it stays in the atmosphere for a much shorter period. So using trees to offset emissions, particularly methane emissions, makes a lot more sense than using trees to offset emissions from, say, a power plant, which some of those will be in the atmosphere for centuries. So that's one of the major reasons for grouping these and thinking about using land sector sink to offset agricultural emissions. Another is the technical challenges I mentioned. So we can use these sinks to offset emissions in agriculture while we're working out how to actually directly reduce those emissions that still have a ways to go to figure out the technical challenges there. And lastly is the basic on the ground logistics. The actions that need to be done to mitigate agriculture emissions and the decisions that need to be made to increase the land sink are often made by the same people. Farmers are really the decision makers in this for a large area of Victoria's land. So it makes quite a lot of sense to group these. And so from here on, when I discuss net emissions, I'm talking about both agriculture and land use together, combining those and thinking of using the land sector as a sink to offset agricultural emissions. And this slide is showing what that looks like. So in 2016, I mentioned it was a compared to other years, it was fairly low emissions from agriculture, and it was a very large sink. So the net emission from agriculture and land use sectors that year was 1.8 megatons. That increased to 3.7 megatons in 2017. So I think two takeaways from this slide are: one, getting to net zero for agriculture and land use combined is achievable. This is something that can be done. To do it in 10 years will be a challenge, and that is because of the decreasing land sink that I've mentioned. And you can see by 2020 that net is projected to be 8 megatons. So it's doable, but the recent emissions might make it seem like a bit easier of a task than it would actually be. So on to the assumptions that I've used to generate the scenarios. I used 2 levels of emissions growth in agricultural emissions. The 10-year growth in emissions in agriculture ranged from a low of nearly, or just over a negative 14% up to 12.2%. So at the highest end since 1990, the largest growth in agricultural emissions over 10 years has been 12.2%. And I used that as the maximum growth in emissions. And then I also used 2.8%, which is more in the range of what is it's the 95% confidence interval of the range, the historic range. So there were the scenarios with really high emissions growth and then not as high. But both of these are conservative to ensure that these estimates are going to be able to take into account if the next 10 years have high emissions growth compared to historic levels. So the optimistic mitigation scenarios include added mitigation in the agriculture sector. And these, again, are ambitious targets. There are quite a few, primarily financial, but regulatory and several other constraints that keep options that are available from being implemented. But these values are technically achievable. And so these are what the scenarios have been based on. And if you're interested in the options that could achieve this level of mitigation, I'm happy to go over that in the question and answer period. So this is, using these assumptions, this is the results. I've included the recent historic values and the 2020 projection for comparison. If you do not do any mitigation in agriculture, you get a total emission of 15.5 to 17.3 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents. depending on how much you assume emissions are going to grow in the next 10 years. And if you implement mitigation, then that would be 12.1 to 13.5, again, depending on the emissions growth. The sink that I have included here, the status quo sort of scenario with no mitigation is a net sink of 5 megatons, and that's based on recent trends in the different sinks and sources in the land use sector. And the 13.5 is if you could achieve that status, on top of the status quo, you could add the largest historic 10-year increase in the land sink. So again, that is a big challenge, but if you were to achieve it, you could have a net zero agriculture and land use emission in 2030, even with high emissions growth. And if your emission growth was lower, then you would be achieving net negative for those two sectors. So yes, that is the results based on those assumptions. And I'm happy to take any questions. I'd turn it back over to you, Dylan.
Great, thanks, Rachelle. I think I've just got a couple of quick summary slides. Where are they?
See, oh, there we go.
Okay. Yeah, so I guess just to sort of quickly summarise these preliminary findings, basically what we've been able to sort of illustrate, or what we've been able to find, is that you know, a combination of these strategies would actually, and with respect to Rachelle's, not the negative emissions scenario, but the sort of net zero emissions for the agriculture and land use sector, would be able to you know, result in emissions falling by 70 megatons per annum by 2025, and which is us. I think that might actually supposed to be might be a mistake there, but this is these results are in line with the trajectory highlighted or identified in the combo review that is consistent with the 1.5C scenario. Now, there's a whole heap of I guess other things that we want to elucidate in this work, and one of them is around employment opportunities and investment opportunities, particularly in the context of the sort of strange world that we have found ourselves in. So these are some preliminary numbers that are still subject to variation, but I guess a lot of these opportunities also come with a huge, I guess, a huge you know, potential boost to jobs and investment in the state, and that's something that we'll be you know, putting a bit of attention on in terms of the final report as well. But yeah, I guess, so I hope you've enjoyed this sort of this preview of what we've been looking at, and stay tuned for the final report, and yeah, please ask any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Dylan and Rachelle. Both fantastic presentations, and lots of material to dig into, and we have a lot of questions reflecting that. I think we have only 10 minutes before the end of the scheduled seminar, and we're unlikely to get through them all. We can probably stay on the line for a few minutes after for those who have time to do that, but otherwise, as Dylan and Rachelle said, this is a sort of summary and a taste of material that will be in the public domain, and we are very keen to facilitate conversations around this work outside of the seminar as well. So we'll start with a question by Nick Aberley. Would you like to read out your question, Nick? I'll just...
I think I'm on mute.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Dylan, it was just a question. I mean, you flagged it in your talk around the assumptions around coal power station closure. Obviously, that's where the biggest single source of emissions in Victoria is. And the comment I put in the chat was just, my understanding is that for the most part, when you build renewable energy in Victoria, it actually leads to a reduced output from coal generators in New South Wales, not so much from Victoria. I mean, obviously there's in Victoria. So just wondering how you got to, like, are you assuming reduced output from Victorian generators rather than actually closing, or how do you get to those emissions outcomes?
Yeah, sure. No, that's, and there's a bit of a, there was a couple of, yeah, basically reduced output is the answer. And there's a couple of, yeah, there's an accounting question in there that's a bit of a challenge for Victoria to think about, I think, is that, you know, if we start reducing emissions in New South Wales, they are not going to be, sort of mentioned the territorial emissions at the start. If we start reducing emissions in New South Wales, that's not under the sort of the current accounting approach, that's not actually attributable to Victoria. But in terms of the results that I presented, they were definitely around territorial emissions in Victoria, and it was essentially a result. The result was that, you know, a lot of coal utilisation rates drop. Now that's not to say that they're ramping more or anything like that. They're still, in terms of our model, they're still constrained to their existing ramp rates and that sort of stuff. But you do see some strange things happen. For example, you might, you know, have a power station that turns off for several months of the year and only turns on over summer. Now, this was actually something that was recommended for, I think, Hazelwood when the carbon price came in. That basically you'd I guess mothball the power plant over you know, winter or the shoulder periods, and have it on and available in summer for a period. Now that's not a bad outcome from an emissions perspective, but to be honest, because you're still reducing the output, but there's a lot of questions, I guess, around the financial viability of a coal plant that runs like that, and whether or not you know, that's a separate question to a sort of least cost modelling exercise, and that's more, you know, it's entirely up to the power plant operator to decide when they, you know, want to how long they want to stick around on, you know, that's a, yeah, it's sort of a financial question around when it actually leaves, but certainly the output from the 3 remaining power stations is significantly reduced.
Yeah, cool. I'll just add quickly on the Victorian Government is painfully aware of the fact of that accounting challenge of, you know, not being able to claim the benefits of reduced coal generation in New South Wales. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Dylan. Stephen Pollard, we'll come to you now. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, here I am. Hi, thanks for that great presentation. Just a question about whether the modelling considered any scenarios involving green hydrogen, such as the Minister mentioned in her introduction, whether hydrogen could have an impact within the 2025 to 2030 timeframes you're focused on, and what kind of impact that may be.
Yeah, so the answer is yes and no. Yes, well, not in the results that I've presented, but so one of the things that we've added to our electricity modelling is the ability to build essentially, you know, open cycle gas turbines or peaking generators that run on hydrogen. Now, this basically reduces the net, you know, so peaking generators like open cycle gas turbines don't have a very high capacity factor. They typically run sort of, you know, maybe even 1% of the year or less. And there are, you know, AEMO is actually starting to integrate this into their next iteration of modelling as well, is basically having hydrogen provide that peaking role where it basically reduces the need to build open cycle gas turbines. Now, they're actually, because they don't run very often, you know, they have a very low capacity factor. The fact that they're burning hydrogen actually doesn't matter so much. You know, hydrogen's expensive, but if you're only running a fraction of the year, that's actually not a very, you know, and when they're running, typically the electricity prices might be, you know, thousands of dollars a megawatt hour. The fact that hydrogen might be more expensive than gas is actually a little bit irrelevant in that. What we haven't looked at, and what I'm personally a bit skeptical of, or I'm not particularly fond of, is the idea of putting gas into the reticulated, putting hydrogen into the reticulated gas system, you know, for heating, or, you know, putting, you know, shandying hydrogen into the existing gas network, simply because you know, my view is there's better alternatives and better uses of infrastructure and capital to provide that energy service, whether it's energy efficiency or electrification or whatever, putting gas into the existing hydrogen into the existing gas network doesn't seem like a sensible idea to me. But having said that, I haven't actually modelled it. So the answer is sort of. We are starting to consider hydrogen, but only in the electricity supply, providing that peak capacity, and it's not actually in the results that we have shown.
Great, thanks, Dylan. Phil Creveld, we'll come to you next. I should have said at the start, if people could introduce themselves and any affiliations when they ask the question, that's always useful and interesting for all of us.
Hello, can you hear me, Rebecca?
Yes, we can hear you now, Phil.
Okay.
Thanks.
Phil Creveld. I represent the interests of a company called CT Lab in South Africa. I'm an electrical engineer. My question is to you, Dylan. In regard to penetration of renewables, all very admirable, and we need to do that. There is one thing that's being totally lost, almost totally, in my conversations with AEMO. Perhaps I won't mention names, but I've talked extensively to 4 of their engineers. There is an absence of monitoring of instantaneous voltage angles, of power flow, and because we are using rather conflicted links, particularly for solar farms, where the short circuit capacity approaches the output power of the solar farm, we're running into all kinds of problems that need to be fixed, not to speak of the solar rooftop penetration, which we all know it's not being talked about, but AEMO again realizes it in their latest report of April 2020. There are all kinds of nasty problems occurring and they're not being addressed. They need to be addressed. But getting the attention of people who don't see the profit motive is very difficult, because there is in fact a regulatory requirement rather than a profit motive that needs to spread throughout the NEM. And I think AEMO realizes it, but they say we are the operator and we can't influence the TSOs and the DNSPs. Could you comment on this, please?
Yeah, sure. I can comment on it. I can't give you perhaps the answer you'd like, but so look, I think AEMO is certainly very much aware of these issues, at least with the people that I speak with. And actually, they did publish a report relatively recently, I'm going to say in the last month or two, on the Renewable Integration Study. It touches on some of these issues, not exactly what you're talking about, but it is certainly something that's in, so I talked a bit about the integrated system plan. Now that actually has, I think, at least 3 separate modelling stages, and the stage that I sort of replicate and I'm most familiar with is the second stage. There's actually a third stage that, that's for the power electronic engineers, that the PSSE modelling, and they do all the really dynamic, really fine timescale modelling. And I'd be incredibly surprised. In fact, I don't believe that they would not be thinking about these issues. And certainly, the rooftop solar issue is something they've also they're very much aware of, and they're worried about minimum generation levels now, and particularly in South Australia in a couple of years' time. So I don't think it's, and there is absolutely regulatory barriers to whose responsibility that is. But as new solar farms and new renewable energy farms are having much more difficulty connecting because of some of the newer requirements, I think there is starting to be a bit of a financial imperative for solar, from the business community to get on top of these things. Yeah, perhaps it's not as fast as people would like, but I certainly think this is an issue that is, AEMO's got their finger on the pulse on this one at the moment. But yeah, I'm not actually an electrical engineer, or so you're probably best directing your question to someone who is.
Great, thanks, Dylan. We'll come now to Kate Noble, who has a question more for Rachelle. And then I'm aware we're already at 12:01, so we'll call a close to the seminar formally at that point. And but if those people would like to stay on to continue with some questions for a few minutes, then we'll also facilitate that. Kate.
Hello, apologies if you can hear my dogs barking in the background. My question is about the transition from gas, and I work at the City of Melbourne as my affiliation. My question is about the transition from reticulated gas. Is there a date that we need to get out of gas by to stay within that 1.5 degree budget? And did you consider the transition from existing reticulated gas networks versus us not installing them in new urban renewal projects? So I'm just looking for like the order of the transition. Thanks.
Yeah, that's definitely something we look at in terms of the demand forecast for electricity. There's a couple of different I guess scenarios or inputs or assumptions around what you think, or what's going to happen to electricity demand as we will hopefully phase out reticulated gas. Replacing with things like, well, energy efficiency, heat pumps, and so on, and all the electrical alternatives. Now that is sort of embedded in some of the demand forecasts and demand traces, and it's just a matter of I guess making sure you use the scenario that you're interested in. And in our case, we have used a high electrification kind of scenario. The question about when we need to get out of it to stay in line with 1.5 budget, that's a hard question to answer. It's a bit of a how long's a piece of string, and it comes to how you allocate the budget, because it is if gas. I mean, we could use gas for a long time and then have no budget for anything else, or we could get rid of it, straight away and have a bigger budget for the harder things to decarbonise. So yeah, it's there's no unfortunately there's no simple number or year that I can say that we need to to be consistent with 1.5. We need to be out, but the sooner the better.
Thanks, Dylan. Sorry, and now another Kate, who is the one who actually has the question for Rachelle. Sorry, two Kates. Kate Phillips. Kate, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Great talk, really interesting. My question was just about the scale of the fires over and whether that provided a significant source, or whether in the bigger picture it wasn't such a, it's hard to know from a non-specialist area how big it is. Oh, my affiliation is I'm a curator at Museums Victoria.
Okay, yeah, I'm actually quite curious how that is going to play out as well. These calculations won't be done for some time, so I can't give a definitive answer on that one. But generally speaking, I would think that there's going to be a very large emission associated with that. There's also later on going to be a sink, because as the revegetation occurs and the trees grow back, then they'll be taking up carbon. But certainly for 2020, there's going to be a very large emission associated with that.
I'll ask a follow-up question, Rachelle. I could be wrong on this, but isn't just from an accounting perspective, isn't bushfire emissions sort of not counted or something?
Yeah, I actually haven't really looked into this, but it's a bit tricky. And then it also it gets updated over time as well, as the full cam modeling is done post-fire and as it grows back. So yeah, it is a bit of a, you you have the emission, but then it is like a biological cycle sort of thing. So it's the accounting is a bit difficult.
Great. Now I'm just checking who's still available. We had and who would like to continue to ask their question. Fiona Haynes, would you like? You asked a very interesting question. Would you like to raise that now? I think you're still muted. I think we should be able to hear you now. Fiona, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I guess mine's a very broad question. I'm just trying to, and thanks very much for your presentations, grasp in concrete terms when you're talking about these scenarios of emission reduction. What kinds of things for, you know, and I'm a criminologist, so, you know, at University of Melbourne. I mean, what are some of the concrete things that you're putting into your models that are going to take us where we need to go? And how do you determine what to put in and what to take out? Is it what's economically feasible, what's socially feasible, what's politically feasible, what's legislatively feasible? How do you go about assessing feasibility?
Yeah, sounds like that could be for both of us.
Yeah. I'm going to answer on behalf of the land use sector, and I can answer on behalf of the other.
Okay, sounds good. So in my case, this was based a lot on historic trends, so that I could really tie it down to existing, like the current state of things. So the emissions growth scenario is based on historic emissions growth, for instance. The mitigation side, I just put up some percentages, right? Like a 50% reduction in methane emissions from manure. And that is based just on knowledge of the technologies available. So when it comes to manure emissions, particularly in intensive systems where the livestock are held together, aerobic digesters can be used to take the methane and turn it into energy. So this is an ERF methodology. It's been taken up quite a bit in piggeries, and can reduce emissions quite substantially, like above 60% reduction in manure methane emissions. The reason this isn't really applied in other sectors is because Victoria has mostly extensive livestock production systems. This, in some contexts, this is changing, and if we could encourage these systems to be adopted in those places where farmers are deciding, generally for other reasons, feed wastage or heat stress, various other reasons why someone might decide to intensify their system, they could be able to take that up. And so 50% seems reasonable for manure methane, and there are other technologies. In the case of enteric methane, it's often diet, increasing dietary fats and various other options that you can change the diet to reduce enteric methane emissions. Precision agriculture will help reduce emissions from soils. And there are many other options, and just knowing how effective they are and where they can be implemented feasibly is what those numbers were really based on. So I think that's plenty from the ag side. Dylan, if you wanted to.
Mm-hmm. No, it's an excellent question, Fiona, and it's a bit of a problem with a lot of this. A lot of the normal approach that people take with this is basically it's a techno-economic kind of cost minimization exercise. Certainly, that's what that's what AEMO does, and I think that's limited on a whole number of reasons that I won't get into. But so in the case of what we're doing, that we're not doing just a simple least cost exercise. I mean, the fact that we're including things like the VRET, the 25% and 40% VRET, or an accelerated 50% VRET, they are they are political decisions, I guess. And so in that sense, you could say that it's a politically constrained optimization. So I mean, it's sort of yeah, I mean, if you wanted to do it in a purely sort of, and to some extent, this is kind of this is essentially what AEMO does, is that they'll have an emissions budget for the electricity sector, and then they'll put that in with a whole range of other, make sure the lights stay on, keep costs low, and stay within the emissions budget. And that's essentially the limit of their it's a bit crude, but that's where their boundaries are. I mean, it's perhaps for good reasons. I don't think it's really the role of the market operator to be a central planner or planning the economy outside of the electricity sector. Different people have different views on that. They're deciding. It becomes problematic if they decide where particular projects are going to go, in my view at least. So in terms of the electricity sector modelling, we're definitely not just doing the least cost. It's least cost. It's bounded least cost. Let's say it's least cost within political constraints or social constraints or so on. Similar issues happen. So that's a quick answer for the electricity sector. The transport sector is also similarly problematic, I think, in terms of there's actually not a great deal of good research into electrification of the research sector, or at least we've only found a pretty scant research in this area, and a lot of it is around essentially those economic decisions of sort of agent-based modelling, where they assume rational people behaviour and all the rest. So that is a limitation that we've sort of absorbed into with respect to the the transport sector. I guess a good example of another project that we a project or a strategy that we have explicitly included that would probably would not fall within the least cost modelling done by the likes of AEMO is the Star of the South project. Now, that if you're just looking at the electricity sector in isolation, and that project in particular, and if you don't think about issues with opposition to wind farms in regional Victoria or at various other parts of the country, then maybe you wouldn't build it. But you've got to remember that there's a community down there that is it's one of the communities. I'm talking Latrobe Valley / the offshore oil and gas industry that is going to be negatively affected by any transition to a cleaner economy in some how that happens. So there's sort of objectives that sit outside of least cost optimization of the electricity sector that mean that project might actually be a worthwhile thing to do because of the transition of the jobs and livelihoods and workers in that local community. That's just an example. I mean, there's other things that aren't perfectly captured in the existing sort of modelling framework. Things like around there's the workforce that already exists down there. There's an offshore oil and gas industry that is somewhat retrofittable to an offshore wind industry. There's a huge amount of transmission cables down there, connecting up to the brown and coal-fired power stations that are sort of underutilised now, particularly with the closure of Hazelwood. I mean that they are partially captured in some of the modelling, but those sort of considerations are usually avoided. So anyway, that's a long way of answering your question, but it's definitely not just a simple so-called objective or least cost optimization or anything like that.
Thank you so much, Dylan and Rachelle, and everyone who's attended and asked excellent questions. We're now 15 minutes over time, and I feel like we should probably wrap this up. I also would just reiterate that this is there's going to be more material coming out about this work, and we really strongly encourage all of the people who have attended today and have continuing questions to stay in touch and continue to engage with us, Rachelle and Dylan, directly to have conversations on this. It's really important and interesting work, and a great example of some of the value that a university can bring to the debate in presenting a quite independent view on what could be achieved. So thank you all for attending. It's fantastic to see so many people here. We've had well over 100 people join us today, and I'd give you a virtual round of applause, Dylan and Rachelle. We do have upcoming seminars, which I'll just encourage you to also join. Actually, we usually have our upcoming seminars. In fact, we don't have any listed on a slide for you today, but they will be advertised on the website for both the Energy Transition Hub and the Climate and Energy College. It's been great moving to Zoom and seeing so many people continue to join us. So we will be notifying you of new ones shortly. Thanks again, everyone.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Rachelle, and thanks everyone for attending and your excellent questions.
Yes.